The Bell of Fate. In the shadow of the war years, people were forever haunted by the image of absolute power, a power that came from guns, from giant tanks crushing the streets, from screaming airplanes in the sky, sowing terror and destruction. It was the power of domination, of evil, of despair. But this story is not about that kind of power. It's about a different kind of strength, one that hides in the most unexpected places, born from the extraordinary resilience and courage of a single person. It is the strength of a young woman seemingly harmless, yet carrying a will of steel capable of standing against a colossal war machine. The strength of conviction, of hope, and of an indomitable spirit. It was like a small candle, yet it had the power to illuminate a dark corner of history. That woman was Helene Deschamps, a name almost forgotten by history, but her story is one of the greatest legends of the French Resistance. On the outside, she was a kind, gentle woman with a friendly smile and clear eyes. But deep within, she carried an iron will, a spirit that would never surrender. Her small hands did not hold a gun. They held an old, crumpled envelope containing a secret that could change the course of an entire war. A secret powerful enough to alter the flow of history, to protect the innocent, and to plant the seeds of hope in a world consumed by despair. This is not just a story about war, but a story about the true nature of courage. The Gestapo, the brutal secret police of Nazi Germany, spent years hunting her. They used every means, every savage tactic to track down this little bird. But they always failed. How could a seemingly ordinary woman evade the most relentless manhunt in history? And why, in a world full of violence and death, did she never give up on her ideals? This story will lift the veil of secrecy and take us back to the darkest years of history to find the answers, to understand the true power of courage, resilience, and an unbreakable will. It is a bell of fate, a call to those who yearn to hear the stories that history tried to conceal. Background and motivation: when freedom was stolen. Helene Deschamps, born in 1921, grew up in a military family in rural France, educated in an environment that valued freedom, patriotism, and traditional values. She had no political ambitions or desire to be a hero. She loved her simple life, the romantic beauty of her homeland, and believed in a bright future where peace and freedom reigned. She believed the world would always be that way, forever safe. She was wrong. That peace was a fragile illusion, easily shattered by the brutal force of war. Like a crystal mirror breaking into 1,000 pieces, her life was split into two halves, the radiant half of the past and the gray, bleak half of the present. In 1940, the German army marched into Paris. The lives of Helene and millions of other French citizens changed forever. Their right to freedom was stolen, their national pride trampled. The brutality of the Nazis and the Gestapo became a daily nightmare. Helene witnessed it all. She saw her neighbors arrested, innocent people beaten, heard the screams, and felt the despair that spread everywhere. She couldn't stand by and watch. Her patriotism ignited, turning her fear into a fierce flame of anger, a flame so powerful it could not be extinguished. She knew that if she didn't fight, she would lose everything. She could not accept a life of oppression, a life without freedom. She made a decision that would change her life forever. The motivation of resistance fighters like Helene was not about glory or grand political ideals. It stemmed from something much simpler: indignation and love for their country. Indignation at seeing their homeland occupied, at seeing innocent people oppressed. Love for her country became the most powerful force driving her to fight. They were people who had nothing to lose, but had everything to fight for their family, their country, and their freedom. That was the essence of the resistance, a movement built on the resilience of ordinary people who refused to be victims of history and became its bravest warriors. Their story is a reminder that even in the deepest darkness, there is always a glimmer of hope, a flame of courage, burning quietly and waiting to be ignited. Joining the Resistance Network, Helene was recruited into the Resistance Network. Her role was called a courier, a messenger, a transporter. A seemingly simple role, but one of the most dangerous in the entire network. This job didn't require physical strength or combat skills, but demanded ultimate courage, sharp intellect, and an incredible ability to remain calm. Every movement, every word had to be carefully calculated because the smallest mistake could cost her life. It was a life of solitude, of secrets, of a constant struggle between her true self and her ideals. She became a ghost in her own life, a person who didn't exist yet carried an invisible power. The role of a courier was a psychological game. They were not allowed to carry weapons. Their harmless appearance, their simple clothes and gestures were their most potent weapons. Every day they had to confront their fear and the suspicion of their enemies. Every checkpoint, every suspicious look from a German soldier could be a death sentence. The smallest mistake, a flustered glance and extra movement could cost them their life. To survive, they had to learn to be a masterful actor, a professional deceiver. They had to learn to control their emotions, to turn fear into calm. And above all, they had to learn to be someone who was never afraid of death. They learned to live in the shadows, to become a part of the darkness, to protect the light of hope. She was trained to recognize signs of danger, Gestapo tricks, and how to read complex codes. Each training session was a lesson in survival. She became proficient, surprisingly calm, and her face no longer held the innocence of a young girl. It had been replaced by the resilience of a warrior, someone ready to sacrifice everything for her ideals. She had to bury her emotions, bury her fear, bury her love and her longing. She had to live a life of secrets, of lies, and of loneliness. But she knew that was the price of freedom, the price for the lives of those she loved. And she was ready to pay that price with her entire life. Legendary missions, the game of death. The mission, to cross 12 checkpoints in one night. One night, Helene received a top-secret mission to transport a vital map through 12 German checkpoints. The only path to her destination was a heavily guarded road. Every checkpoint was a test, a doorway to death that she had to pass through. Everything depended on her composure and her acting skills. She knew that if she failed, the resistance network would be threatened and hundreds of people would die. She had to suppress her fear, turning it into an invisible strength, a power that helped her overcome every obstacle. She had to become someone else, someone who was never afraid. The soldier's suspicion grew. He looked at her muddy shoes where the map was hidden. The slightest moment of panic would have been the end. But Helene was not afraid. She had prepared a fabricated story, a perfect performance. With a look of distress, she began her tale, the story of a worried wife searching for her husband. Her voice trembled, tears welling in her eyes. The mask of harmlessness fooled the soldier. Finally, he let her go, but the tension did not subside. Helene cycled on, but the camera continued to follow. Every meter of the road was a trial, a deadly gamble. She had won, but the price she paid was her own life, rescuing a downed Allied pilot. In another mission, Helene had to rescue a downed Allied pilot. Both had to travel through an area where the Gestapo was carrying out an intense manhunt. Their cover was that they were siblings, but a small mistake in their words or an unusual gesture could get them caught. This time, Helene had to play a much more difficult role. She had a story ready. The pilot was her brother, mute from birth. Her mother was Polish, which was why his eyes were a different color. Everything was meticulously prepared, but the Gestapo officer's suspicion remained. He stared at the pilot's eyes, looking for a sign of deception. But the pilot had also been trained. He remained silent, showing no reaction. The confrontation between reason and emotion took place in a matter of seconds. Finally, the Gestapo officer let them go. Helene led the pilot away, but fear still showed on her face. They had escaped death by a hair's breadth. This story is not just about survival, but about trust, hope, and humanity in the midst of war. Distracting the secret police. In another situation, Helene used an extremely daring tactic. She knew that if the entire group were captured, the resistance network would collapse. She volunteered to go outside, deliberately dropping a handkerchief with her name embroidered on it, luring the German soldiers and Gestapo to follow her and buying time for her comrades to escape. It was a risky decision, an action for which anyone would pay with their life. She had decided to sacrifice herself to save her comrades. This was an act of courage, an act that not everyone would dare to do. Helene used her courage and intellect to deceive the enemy to purchase life for her comrades. She was victorious, but the price she paid was her own life. The cloak of invisibility tactic. Helene Deschamps turned weakness into a strength. Her gentle appearance and simple clothes made her seem nothing like a spy. That was her perfect cloak of invisibility. She didn't need to hide in the shadows because she blended into the crowd perfectly. No one would think that a young, kind girl could be a threat. She is a prime example of how intelligence and resilience can triumph over brute force. She was not a victim, she was the architect of survival. She created a perfect cover, a cover that no one could have ever suspected. This cover was not just a tactic, but a part of her life. She had to live a life of secrets, of lies, and of loneliness. But she knew that was the price of freedom, the price for the lives of those she loved. In the psychology of warfare, people tend to judge their opponents based on preconceived notions. The Gestapo and German soldiers believed that spies and resistance fighters had to be strong, aggressive men. They never considered that a young, gentle girl could be a dangerous thorn in their side. Helene used her body language and innocent eyes to appear harmless. She is a perfect example of how intelligence and resilience can triumph over brute force. She was not a victim. She was the architect of survival. She created a perfect cover, a cover that no one could have ever suspected. It was a brilliant tactic, a tactic that saved hundreds of lives. She lived a life of secrets, of lies, and of loneliness. But she knew that was the price of freedom, the price for the lives of those she loved. And she was ready to pay that price with her entire life. Moments close to death. During a strict checkpoint, Helene was unfortunately captured. That was the moment she stood on the razor's edge between life and death. She was tortured not with whips, but with sharp questions and brutal psychological games. Her enemy was not a gun, but suspicion, psychological torture. Helene had to face an unequal fight, a battle between reason and emotion. She had to suppress her fear, turning it into an invisible strength, a power that helped her overcome every obstacle. She had to become someone else, someone who was never afraid. Tears streamed down her cheeks. She trembled, feigning fear. But deep in her eyes there was an unwavering flicker of resilience. She had created a story, a perfect lie to protect her comrades. The Gestapo officer was still suspicious, but he had no evidence. Her trembling, her feigned innocence made him believe she was just a small, harmless pawn. He released her, but the suspicion in his eyes remained. From then on, Helene knew she was being closely watched by the Gestapo. She had become a prey in their game, but she was not afraid. She continued to fight to live for freedom for her homeland. She knew that her life was not just her own, but belonged to those she loved, to those she was protecting. And she was ready to pay that price with her entire life. The end of the war and her legacy. The war ended. Helene Deschamps survived, but her heart remained with those who had fallen. Her legacy is not a collection of gleaming medals or erected statues. Her legacy is the stories, the memories of the courage and silent sacrifice of those who protected France. Those stories have inspired millions, becoming a flame of resilience and patriotism. She lived a full life, but never forgot those who had fallen. She lived to tell their story, to honor the silent heroes. She lived to tell their story, to honor those who had sacrificed. And she became a symbol of courage, of resilience, and of hope. Her story is a reminder that even in the deepest darkness, there is always a glimmer of hope, a flame of courage burning quietly and waiting to be ignited. Helene Deschamps is a living testament to the strategic importance of people without guns in a war. They were the backbone of the intelligence network, the champions in the shadows. Their courage and sacrifice changed the course of history, but their names are often forgotten. Helene survived to tell their story, to honor the silent heroes. She lived to tell their story, to honor those who had sacrificed. And she became a symbol of courage, of resilience, and of hope. Her story is a reminder that even in the deepest darkness, there is always a glimmer of hope, a flame of courage burning quietly and waiting to be ignited. If you believe that wars are only decided on the battlefield, remember Helene Deschamps. Remember the woman who proved that one person's will can be stronger than an army. Her story is not just an old page of history. It's a reminder that the greatest things sometimes come from the most unexpected places. It's a reminder that heroes are not always commemorated with statues. They are the ones who live in the shadows, but carry within them an invisible power, a power that can change the world. And if you want to discover more stories about silent hero secrets that history wants you to forget, subscribe and hit the bell icon today. Because history is not just what's written in textbooks. History always has stories worth telling, secrets waiting for us to uncover. Join us together to discover those stories, to honor those who sacrificed, to remember those who fought, and to never forget what happened. Because only when we remember can we learn, and only when we learn can we build a better future.